Today we're going to delve into a very heated topic, and that is the top 10 worst classic car engines that were produced. And for the purposes of this video, we're going to talk about engines that really are at least 25, 30 years old here. So we're not going to talk about the modern engines, which might include some from various automakers, some that blow spark plugs out, which some of you will know about, or some that have the water pump within the engine. So you have to basically remove half of the engine to change the water pump, or those with a wet oil pump belt. We're not going to talk about those here. You can put a comment in the comment section as to what you think about those. This is going to be focused on engines in classic cars and what I think are the worst engines. And curious, let me know your thoughts. Put a comment in the comment sections. Tell me if you think I got it right. Again, this is just focused on those engines in classic vehicles. Let's get started with number 10. And at number 10, we have the Lincoln V12 engine. Now, for this one, you're really going to have to go back in your memory because Lincoln hasn't produced a V12 engine since the World War II era and a little bit before that. But this is an interesting engine overall, this Lincoln Zephyr V12, because it's really kind of a Ford flathead V8 that has a couple more cylinders added in a few ways. It obviously has some differences. It does have a narrower bank angle, 75 degrees between the cylinder banks versus 90 degrees for the Ford flathead V8, which was introduced in 1932. But Lincoln produced this Zephyr V12 beginning in the 1936 model year. And at that time, in 1936, it displaced 267 cubic inches and produced 110 horsepower. Now, the problem associated with the Zephyr V12 was that in that first model year in particular, it had a number of challenges. First of all, it had inadequate crankcase ventilation that often caused sludge buildup in the event that drivers weren't really revving the engine. And it also had relatively poor oil flow and had a tendency to overheat, which would then cause ring wear, and then it would become an oil burner. Now, there were a number of reasons for the overheating condition. One was that the water passages were too small in the initial variant of the Zephyr engine. And the other was that Lincoln had a radiator fan that was mounted to the crankshaft, not to the water pump. So not only did the fan turn relatively slowly, because it was on the crankshaft and wasn't on a smaller pulley, but it was also located very low. And if you take a look at what the Zephyrs looked like back then, you'll notice that the grill, this opening was very narrow at the bottom. And consequently, it was hard for these engines to get adequate cooling. In fact, this was really what led to the refined design of the Zephyr when it was redesigned. With these large lower grills, that was to help the engine suck in air and also reduce the overheating conditions. Most people think that was just design, but no, it actually was functional. And Lincoln did end up improving the V12, particularly after that 1936 model year. It did get hydraulic lifters, for example, in 1938. It was expanded to 292 cubic inches in 1940 and 41. And for a single month of production in 1942, it actually hit 306 cubic inches and was rated at 130 horsepower. However, this particular version was found to have a number of challenges because due to boring it out to 306 cubic inches, it was found that the cylinder walls were too thin. And so it only lasted for a very, very brief period of time before it was scrapped. So the Lincoln Zephyr V12, beautiful car. And really, they weren't horrible engines after the 1936 model year, but they got this terrible reputation because of what was first produced in 1936. Let's move on to number 9. And at number 9, we're going to have one that I get some hate mail about, but that's okay. This is the 2.5-liter Iron Duke 4-cylinder engine produced by General Motors. Now, this engine was produced from 1977 to 1993, and it first came out in the Pontiac version of the Chevrolet Vega called the Astra. Well, that was a rather, let's say, not great beginning for this engine, but it ended up in almost everything General Motors produced, from Camaros to S10 pickup trucks to X-body cars, the Citation, the Phoenix, the Oldsmobile, the Buick Skylark, the A-body cars, the Chevrolet Celebrity, Pontiac 6000, Olds Cutlass Sierra, Buick Century, the N-body cars, the Buick Somerset, the Olds Calais, the Pontiac Grand Am. It was pretty hard to find a General Motors engine in the 1980s, or I should say a General Motors car in the 1980s that didn't have this engine in it. It was so gosh darn popular. And it was a relatively reliable engine. Let me say that up front. It was reliable in general. But it was so unrefined and crude, at least until the 1988 model year when it got balance shafts in the oil pan, that I would contend that it turned so many buyers off from American vehicles during this time frame, at least for passenger cars. If you got one of these in an S10 pickup, you probably didn't care. It was a reliable workhorse. It was very slow. It made around 90 horsepower over the years. The later ones did get a little bit up over 100. And again, they were reliable. They were used in the Grumman LLV postal vehicles for a number of years. But they are so crude and noisy and just unrefined that if you drove a car with this engine, then you went down the street to the local Honda or Toyota dealer and drove one of those, there was no way that you were buying the General Motors car. It just was like you had a McCormick Deering engine under hood. They had something that was the equivalent of a Rolls-Royce four-cylinder, seemingly. So, again, reliable engine. I own one. I've owned many cars with Iron Duke engines. I would own another one. But I own them as used cars. I don't own them as having paid retail price for them off the showroom floor. And I think that's really the difference. Again, so when you have one of these, they do have some minor issues, one of which is the valve cover gaskets always leak on these. And the main one is that most of the variants don't have a timing chain. They have timing gears that interface with one another directly, and they're plastic. The gear teeth are plastic. So after about 120, 130,000 miles, it tends to share a teeth, and then your engine stops. Now, the problem is it's very, very hard to get this timing gear off without dropping the engine, and so it generally junks the vehicle. But they do last until that point, and they are very reliable. Of course, they're outfitted with GM's throttle body injection, which again is reliable. But overall, just the refinement and the lack of refinement on this engine is what makes it number 9 on this list. And the interesting part, I will say, is that one of GM's top priorities in developing the engine was that it be smooth, and that's why it has a 4-inch bore by a 3-inch stroke. The thought was that the short stroke would help quell some of the vibrations. Well, it didn't work. In any case, let's move on to number 8. And at number 8, we have an engine that actually is derived from one of the best engines of all time, the Chevrolet 350, but here we're going to put the Chevrolet 305 on the list. A Chevrolet V8 engine on this list of worst engines of all time. What in the world is going on here? Well, just hold your fire for a second. Now, the 305 was introduced in 1976 and continued on through 1998, and for many years it actually was a pretty good engine during that run. The problem is the earliest variants from 1976 through the early 1980s had a very challenging issue, and that is that they were prone to wearing out their camshaft lobes prematurely. Now, this was a result of some improper manufacturing on GM's part with the camshafts. They didn't have the hardness that they were supposed to have, which, by the way, also afflicted some other GM engines that are on this list. But that combination of the premature camshaft wear as well as the lackluster performance that was often found associated with these 305s lands it on the list. And like I said, the camshaft lobe wear is a relatively common occurrence on these 305s. If you have one of these vintage 305s, the best advice that I can have for you is to make sure that you're using an oil with ZDDP, or you put an additive in when you're changing your oil that has ZDDP. Because a lot of these engines don't have roller lifters, and as a consequence, there's pretty high pressure on the valve components, and the new oils that are being used don't have that additive in them, and it's a great anti-wear additive. So that would be my best advice if you have a vehicle with an early Chevrolet 305 from 1976 through, let's say, 1984-ish, something in that zip code. Aside from that, they were relatively reliable engines. They were able to use a lot of the 350 cubic inch V8's parts, but it really was this camshaft lobe issue that did a lot of these in prematurely. Let's move on to number 7. And at number 7, we switch over to the Ford family of engines and talk about the Windsor 255 cubic inch V8. 255 cubic inch V8, you say? You haven't heard of that when it comes to the Ford Windsors. You've heard of the 302, the 351, but the 255, and this tells you a lot, was produced for the 1980 to 1982 model years, and that was it. And it was meant to be a stopgap between the 302 being phased out and a new V6 was coming into production. And it really was just an all-around dog. It had rated horsepower around 115 to 122 horsepower. It had specific cylinder heads that used smaller combustion chambers and valves, so you never were going to get any power out of this. And it was found in a lot of different Fords of the era, everything from the Fox chassis cars, which would include the Mustang, the Thunderbird, and the Fairmont, and some variants even like the Panther platform cars, like the Mercury Marquis and the Ford LTD. And on top of the fact that it was an asthmatic engine, it was often outfitted with a variable Venturi carburetor, which was very problematic at the time as well. So customers really just didn't like this. I mean, imagine you're trading in something that likely had a good-sized V8 for something with this 255 in it. And on top of not having the power, you have the variable Venturi carburetor, which is just giving you issues. I shouldn't say continuously, that's not fair, but frequently giving you issues. A lot of people just replaced those variable Venturi carburetors with Autolite 2100s, and they were fine. But this Ford 255, like I said, it was only produced for 1980, 1981, and 1982, and I think that tells you all you need to know. Let's move on to number 6. And at number 6, we have the Mitsubishi 2.6-liter engine that was used in many Chrysler vehicles, including the K cars back in the era. The hemispherical head 2.6-liter engine. Yes, that's right. I said Hemi head 2.6. Yes, lots of horsepower, right? Not quite. About 90 horsepower, a little bit more than that. But this 2.6-liter engine that displaced 156 cubic inches was introduced in the 1981 model year. And like I said, it found its way into a lot of Chrysler products. And, well, let's just say it had a number of issues associated with them. First of all, this was a time frame when many car companies were employing electronic feedback controls with carburetors. And that was both good and bad. It delivered incremental fuel economy, but it also did so with increased complexity. And I can tell you that the carburation system in these Mitsubishi 2.6-liter engines is just complex. It's hard to find parts, and it's not all that reliable compared to other engines, unfortunately. Now, when it was running, it was a relatively smooth engine. It did have balance shafts, and the 2.6 had something called jet cylinder head design, which basically meant that before combustion, a blast of high-pressure air was introduced into the combustion chamber to help better distribute the air-fuel mixture, and then that would reduce nitrous oxide emissions. So that was kind of interesting. But aside from that, the 2.6-liter engine, particularly because of the carburetor issues that I mentioned, as well as some others, including the oil filter being on the backside of the engine in a hard-to-reach location. This was because the engine really wasn't designed to be installed in a front-wheel drive car, but it was at the end of the day. They were also noted for cracking heads, and in some cases, those heads would, let's just say, not necessarily crack, but they would warp. And again, just not a great engine overall. So probably best to stay away from this engine overall, and you don't want to be replacing the heads or trying to fiddle around with the carburetors in these now, as parts are extremely hard to get. Let's move on to number 5. And at number 5, we have the Cadillac V8-6-4 engine from 1981. Now, I just mentioned previously the Ford 255 cubic inch engine that only made it for 3 model years, 1980 through 1982. But here's a 1 model year wonder, the Cadillac V8-6-4 engine. I should say 1 model year wonder in regular passenger cars. I believe it did continue on in limousines for 1982. But this was the first modular displacement engine, and something that's very, very common today. Here, General Motors was introducing it in 1981. The problem is that Well, it had 1981 electronics associated with it. And this is really an interesting method of cylinder deactivation. Here you had mechanisms that would actually deactivate the valves for the cylinders that were shutting down. You can see that by these raised valve covers because of the mechanisms on those particular cylinders. Interestingly, this is a wet intake. It's throttle body injection. It's not multi-port injection. So when those cylinders would shut down and then fire up, you had some pooling of fuel around the intake valves because, well, fuel was still getting injected into the entire intake. And the cylinder displacement functionality on this was a little bit funky. It had not just an 8-cylinder mode and a 4-cylinder mode, but a 6-cylinder mode, an intermediate mode that was relatively imbalanced. And customers tended to complain about that in particular. Also because of those mechanisms that would deactivate the valves on the cylinders, a lot of these engines ended up just kind of sticking in 4-cylinder mode or 6-cylinder mode, and well, that just didn't work. Now, why is this not higher on the list? Well, because if you deactivate this cylinder deactivation feature, which is pretty easy, you unplug one wire, you have a Cadillac 368 cubic inch V8, which is a great engine, and that's what many people did. But as they were born from the factory, this cylinder deactivation feature wasn't necessarily pleasant. Imagine Cadillac buyers really didn't care about fuel economy, and here they were forced to drive around basically being GM's R&D on the fly. And, well, they weren't overly happy with their V8-6-4 engines. And as a result, it lasted just one model year before it would be replaced by arguably an even worse engine, which we're going to get to very shortly. And here we are at number 4. And number 4 is the Cadillac HT4100 4.1-liter V8. Now, I could make an argument that this should go higher up in the list, but it's relatively low given the failure rate of the engine because, well, at least it was only in Cadillacs. And so the damage was confined to those vehicles. But this engine made between 125 and 135 horsepower, and it came out in 1982, was used in Cadillacs through 1987. Unfortunately, as I said, it came out in 1982, and that meant that it was in these big rear-wheel drive, heavy vehicles, or even the front-wheel drive cars. At that time, the Seville and Eldorado were heavy too. And trying to push these things around with this engine really just was not satisfactory. So I will say the engines are very smooth, very, very smooth. In fact, Cadillac engineers consciously wanted to make sure that these engines had a, I'll call it, palatable fast idle when they were started. A lot of cars during this time frame, when you started them, the engines kind of raced as they had lean fuel mixtures. But the Cadillac engineers did sweat that detail that when you start these up, even on a cold morning, the engines don't really rev and they settle into an idle pretty quickly. But that's kind of where the good news stops on these, the smoothness and that startup. Aside from that, the Cadillac 4.1-liter engine had so many issues, everything from oil pump design to internal oiling to blowing intake gaskets to head gaskets. It just was not a good engine. I really can't say too much about it. They were reliable until they weren't. They were outfitted with General Motors digital fuel injection, throttle body fuel injection, and that was reliable. But like I said, when you have an engine that's here, an aluminum block, although it did have cast iron cylinder liners, with an iron head and an aluminum intake, you just have a recipe for a lot of challenges because those metals are expanding and contracting at different rates, putting stress on all the gasket surfaces that are between them. And unfortunately, the gasketing technology back then just couldn't handle it in many cases. And like I said, the intake gasket would blow or the head gasket would blow. Then you've got coolant in the oil. That eats up the bearings, the crankshaft, the camshaft, everything. And in fact, these cars also came from the GM factories, often with soft camshafts because of defects that GM had in its manufacturing process. So not only did you get a poorly designed engine in some cases, you got one that was also poorly manufactured. And the damage that was done to Cadillac's reputation with this engine was so large. And unfortunately, it would actually get perfected. The last version, the 4.9-liter engine that was produced from 1991 through 1994, I believe, was actually a pretty decent engine and reliable. And that would get superseded by the North Star, which many love to hate. So Cadillac's reputation again suffered. But this 4.1 is probably the worst of the worst when it comes to Cadillac and one of the worst overall engines that were produced. And now we move on to number 3, and that is the 4.3-liter Oldsmobile V8 diesel. Now, 4.3-liter V8 diesel, you say, what in the world is that? Many people know about the Olds 350 diesel. What is this 4.3-liter V8 diesel? Well, little do people know that in addition to the 5.7-liter 350 cubic inch V8 diesel, as well as the 4.3-liter V6 diesel that was introduced in 1982 and continued on through 1985, Olds produced a 4.3-liter V8 diesel for one model year only. That was 1979. Now, the thought was here that the big 350 cubic inch diesel would live in the large full-size vehicles like the Chevrolet Caprice, the Olds 8898, Buick Electra, even the Cadillacs, the DeVille and Fleetwood, and pickup trucks. However, GM did produce, as I mentioned, a 4.3-liter V8 diesel. And interestingly, the 4.3-liter V8 diesel only made it into vehicles in the Oldsmobile lineup, the 1979 Olds Cutlass Salon, as well as the Cutlass Supreme and Cutlass Calais. And that was it. That was it for the 4.3-liter V8 diesel. Now, why does it make the list? Well, it had all of the issues that the 5.7-liter had, or at least a fair number of them, and it only made 90 horsepower and 160 pound-feet of torque. That's it. 90 horsepower and 160 pound-feet of torque. So it just had absolutely no power whatsoever. I think Consumer Guide tested one of these Oldsmobiles with this engine, and it took 20 seconds to go from 0 to 60. It was just abysmal. And like I said, it had the challenges that the Olds 350 diesel had, but it also had even less power. That Olds 350 diesel, the earlier ones would make 120 horsepower and 220 pound-feet of torque, so a big difference versus just 90 horsepower and 160 pound-feet. But the 4.3-liter V8 diesel, well, it just was not great. And it has all the issues that we're going to talk about right now associated with the number 2 engine, which is the Olds 350 cubic inch V8 diesel. Now, Oldsmobile had, we just learned, the 4.3-liter V8 diesel in 1979. The 350 cubic inch diesel came out in 1978. 4.3-liter V6 diesel came out in 1982. That one wasn't so bad, actually. But they all ended after the 1985 model year. That was when the Olds diesel program was terminated. And the Olds 350 diesel, it just was not a great design at all. Except for 1985, there was no year with a water separator back in an era where diesel fuel wasn't as high quality as it is today. And so that would cause issues with the injection pumps and drivability. And on top of that, because Oldsmobile and GM wanted to save money as they were designing this engine, they designed the heads basically with the same clamping force, number of head bolts as the gasoline engines. And you can imagine when you've got an engine with 22.5 to 1 compression ratio compared to an engine with 8 to 1 compression ratio, with the same clamping force, same kind of structure for the heads, well, that's just not going to cut it. So despite the fact that the blocks were stiffened, the engine internals were stiffened, the one thing that Olds wanted to do was to be able to reuse the same tooling, and unfortunately that just, well, didn't make sense. Now, over the years, there were some upgrades that were made to the engine, and by the time it was trouble-free, which was around 1981, these were called the Oldsmobile 350 DX block. Those actually aren't that bad, but the reputation was at that point kind of solidified, and unfortunately, these diesels were in everything. Oldsmobile and General Motors sold millions of them. So in 1981 alone, they sold 310,000 units. Pretty crazy. And many customers just did not have a good experience with these engines for those reasons that were mentioned. I mean, if the head bolts aren't strong enough, they would stretch and then it would blow the head gaskets. Well, that's a catastrophic failure. Not good. As I mentioned, the injection pumps tended to have issues as well. And, it's just too bad because otherwise, while they didn't have any power, they did kind of deliver on the promise of offering improved fuel economy and allowing you to drive a big car that actually got good fuel economy. I've had a number of these Olds diesel engines, and they'll routinely get the 5.7-liter V8s 25, 26, 27 miles per gallon on the freeway. They're pretty incredible from that perspective. They are a little noisy and they are a little stinky, but for the time, they actually were relatively refined when it came to being a diesel. They just didn't have a turbocharger or anything that would really help them with power. And as a result, the one thing that they all had in common was that they were pretty gosh darn slow and that they tended to have issues. And because GM sold so many, it really soured Americans on diesels for many, many years to come because of the experiences people had with this engine, mostly related, I would say, again, to the injection pump issues, lack of a water separator, as well as the cylinder head bolt configuration and the bolts themselves even that caused the head gaskets to blow. So for that reason, that makes it to number 2 on the list. Now let's go to number 1. What could number 1 be? Well, it's the Chevrolet Vega 2.3-liter 4-cylinder engine. Now, for those who know GM history, you know the Vega was introduced in 1971, at least the model year 1971, and produced through 1977. And one of the things about the Vega was that it had a very unique aluminum block iron head overhead cam engine. And yes, I said that right, iron head with an aluminum block, and there were no cylinder liners in this. This was the first time that GM produced an aluminum block engine without cylinder liners. And it was a good idea in theory. The problem was that it just didn't pan out in practice. There were problems with the early coatings on the cylinder walls that the piston rings would ride in. Effectively, they would start eating away at the coating, and then it would become an oil burner. They had valve stem sealing issues, and if that failed, it would become an oil burner. They had small radiators, kind of like this 1 foot radiator that were small, and then as the coolant would evaporate, the cooling capacity of the car's system would go down, and that would cause it to overheat. And once it overheated, the piston rings would effectively seize to the cylinder walls, or at least etch them, and then that would create it or cause it to be an oil burner. So the engine was just, especially in the early years, was not a good engine at all. Plus, you have the iron head and the aluminum block that are expanding and contracting at different rates, and that puts stress on the gasket, the head gasket, and as a consequence, sometimes you'd have head gaskets blow as well. Now, on top of all this, it wasn't an overly refined engine, and it didn't sound great, and it didn't make all that good of power. So you didn't get the reliability, and you didn't get the power from the 140 cubic inch 2.3-liter engine. And so the buyers of Vegas, while the cars looked great, I mean, they were really good-looking little cars. Unfortunately, because of the engines as well as rusting issues, people were significantly displeased, and it was a major letdown. A lot of people had significant trust in General Motors because they had owned General Motors products up to this point, and they bought a Vega thinking they were going to get a cute little car. And unfortunately, it became a nightmare for many people and turned them off to GM really for the rest of their lifetimes. So unfortunately, the little Vega's, let's say, 2.3-liter engine was not beloved, and it also had some strange servicing things, like an air cleaner that you couldn't replace. You had to replace the entire housing unless you bought an aftermarket unit. Imagine having to replace the whole housing instead of just replacing a paper element. By the way, this was true on early Chevettes as well. And then you had some other strange Chevrolet cost-cutting features, like as opposed to a twist-off oil fill cap, you had a rubber plug, which wasn't unique to the Vega, but what a bad idea. The rubber, after a number of thermal cycles, just gets hard and brittle, and you don't want that cracking and going down into the engine. So, in any case, not a great setup for the Chevrolet Vega. So what do you think of this list? What did I forget? Would you change the order? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know what you think. Thanks again for watching.